And Jason, do you think all the continents were connected during the vapor canopy?
Oh, yes, I believe you could walk. I believe there's huge areas you could walk. I mean, think about it. I have a video where I show the evidence that the ancient Dravidians of India walked to northern Australia. And then after the collapse of the vapor canopy, that area of the world flooded out. When it flooded out, there was no way to get back. So 4,500 years later, the Dravidians of the Dravidians of southern India maintained their culture over thousands of years. Slight deviations and changes. But the Dravidians that were isolated in northern Australia spread out through Australia because they're trapped there now. There was no way back to India, and they devolved into the Australian Bushmen. They lost their culture, but the ancient Dravidian artifacts have been found in Australia. And the fact that they look very, very similar, and they're basically the only two peoples in the world that even look that way. I have a pretty good video about that. That similarity. But yes, I do believe that there was areas all over the world. I mean, this is what we get. This is what the archaeology shows. We know that the ancient city, basalt city of Metallinen in the Isle of Yap, way out in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, was not built half submerged under the Pacific. We know that the 550-something statues of Moya, the gigantic heads on Easter Island, could have never been built on an island the size of Easter Island today. It must have been much bigger and connected to a much bigger chain of islands. We know that the traditions of the people of Micronesia and Melanesia and Polynesia and Oceania are very specific, that all of their islands used to be bigger and some of the smaller islands were giant islands. Yeah, from a canoe. In a canoe at one time, they could cross the entire Pacific. Yeah, there was no voyages by land. It was just canoe hopping. It was just island hopping all the way from the Asia to the Americas. Can't do that today, but back then they say you could. So, yeah, during the vapor canopy, all the moisture was in the mesosphere. When all the moisture was in the mesosphere, Antarctica had no ice, no snow. There was more land. There was more land in the Pacific. There was more land in the Mediterranean. There was more land in the Atlantic. All these areas were traversable. There are underground ruins everywhere. There's 300 stone cities underwater in the Mediterranean alone. And now, places of human occupation and ancient shorelines have now been detected underwater in the Black Sea. Taking just these few things into consideration, just these few things. There's so much more to consider, like the ruins off Japan, the ruins off India, the ruins off the UK. Listen, there's so many things to consider. If we just take just these things to consider, the vapor canopy pulls the moisture into the mesosphere, which domes over the world. It's thick. It's like a lens at night. It magnifies the stars. It keeps the atmosphere. It builds atmospheric pressure. It pulls the moisture off the surface of the world, so there's only small seas and lakes everywhere. Then there comes a tipping point when the mesosphere can no longer maintain that integrity and it collapses. And when it does, you get 40 to 130 days worth of rain. The whole world floods, but the whole world isn't flooded. A lot of areas there's survivors everywhere. So when that collapse occurs, the atmospheric pressure drops. The oxygen intake it diminishes tremendously. So mammals are the survivors, and reptiles and amphibians have to stop growing to large sizes because they don't have the oxygen anymore. Plants no longer have the carbon monoxide and the nitrogen. They no longer have the things they need, so they grow to the sizes we know them today. When this happens, the poles, whatever, it doesn't matter if you're a flat earther or whatever, the polar extremities now acquire the ice packs rapidly, the snow. They're not doing that now. Less than an inch of snow happens in the Arctic and the Antarctic now a year because those areas are not humid. They're very, very dry. So we have the poles rapidly get buried. It's not like the uniformitarians say, and the glaciologists and those who promote the whole bogus ice age theories, which are totally untrue. None of that's true, guys. This whole ice age theory was built on a whole bunch of false premises that totally ignore the vapor canopy techniques. But what I find interesting is one of the greatest proofs in the 1800s that the ice ages were real was the fact that woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses are among the hundreds of millions of life forms that are found packed in the permafrost, frozen solid. It must have been cold back then because we found them in ice. It must have been cold back then because they're covered in hair. Guys, if you know anything whatsoever about mammalian biology, you will know that among the hairiest creatures in the entire world are all in jungles and deserts. Yeah, guys, nothing these people have told us is true about these ice ages. It's all BS. And now we have all kinds of biologists that have come forth in the last 30 years publishing all these reports that the hair on the woolly mammoths actually cooled them. What do they need to be cooled for if they're already in the Arctic? So, yeah, guys, none of it makes sense. The tulips, undigested tulips on their mouths, the mushrooms that have been found in their hoofs that are frozen. Yeah, none of it makes sense, guys. They were living in a very warm climate when suddenly they were frozen solid.